Good evening. My name is Maria Marable Bunch, and I'm the Director of Education and Public Programs here at the National Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater in Washington, D.C. for our program, the Lincoln Douglas Debates, Known and Unknown. Whether you are here in D.C. or watching on YouTube, thank you for joining us this evening. We are presenting this program in partnership with the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, with support from the Illinois State Society, the Lincoln Forum, the Abraham Lincoln Association of Springfield, Illinois, the Pascal Collection, and the National Archives Afro-American History Society, and we thank them for their support. This program is also presented in commemoration of Black History Month and the bicentennials of Illinois statehood and the birth of Frederick Douglass. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I'd like to tell you about some upcoming programs in this theater. On Wednesday, February 28th through Sunday, March 4th, we will present our annual film screening of the Academy Award nominee documentaries. The screenings are presented by the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Science in partnership with the National Archives Foundation. You can also find other upcoming programs on our website at archives.gov. Tonight, we are honored to have celebrated and talented speakers to bring to life the real and imagined debates between Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, and Frederick Douglass. To introduce our distinguished MC for the evening, I'm pleased to welcome to the stage the Honorable Jerry Weller, President of the Illinois State Society of Washington, D.C., and a former member of Congress who represented Illinois in the U.S. House of Representatives for 14 years. So please welcome Congressman Jerry Weller.
Well, thank you, Maria, and good evening. It's an exciting program, and it's my privilege tonight as president of the Illinois State Society to have the pleasure of welcoming you to this very, very special program. And I especially want to express appreciation to the National Archives for presenting the program in partnership with the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, with support from our Illinois State Society, the Lincoln Forum, the Abraham Lincoln Association of Springfield, Illinois, and the Pascal Collection. This is an exciting year, and as Illinois approaches our bicentennial of statehood, we take pride that our Illinois State Society membership over the years has included some of our nation's greatest political leaders, from Abraham Lincoln to Everett Dirksen to Barack Obama. The Illinois State Society was originally founded in 1854, and today we have 164 years of service to Illinois and our nation. We're all proud Illinoisans, about 1,000 strong. We get together to celebrate our history, our culture, cheer on the sports teams, to network, to make friends. And we have a series of activities to celebrate the Illinois bicentennial this year, including our own Black History event this coming week on the 27th, which is going to celebrate the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to Chicago. And Congressman Daddy Davis, who's a product of that Great Migration, is going to share with us his personal memories, his recollections, and his thoughts about the impact of the Great Migration on Chicago, Illinois, and our nation. So check out our website. We'd love to have you there and be part of this program. It's my pleasure tonight as President of the Illinois State Society at this point to now turn over the evening over to a very distinguished MC, Harold Holzer, who's an award-winning scholar of Abraham Lincoln as well as the American Civil War era. He's written over 50 books on these subjects. So please join me in welcoming Harold Holzer to the podium. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, with special thanks to the Lincoln Group, the Illinois State Society, and all of the sponsors tonight, of course, the National Archives. For Abraham Lincoln, whose 209th birthday we mark this month, there were really two great career debates, both with men named Douglass, in that amazing political career that led to the preservation of the Union and the destruction of slavery. One of the Douglasses was born in Brandon, Vermont in 1813. The other near Hillsborough, Maryland, around 200 years ago in 1818. We don't know precisely when, because his mother was enslaved. And as he put it, no one ever kept an accurate record of his entrance into a world that, without his courage and audacity, might have kept people of color in chains for the rest of the 19th century, along with millions of others. In time, both Douglasses would engage Abraham Lincoln in both formal and informal debates. And that's exactly what we are here at the National Archives to re-experience. Both men, by the way, originally spelled their name the same way, D-O-U-G-L-A-S-S. It was said that Stephen, who soon migrated from the Northeast to Illinois, supposedly dropped the final S so as not to be confused with the African-American leader, Frederick Douglass. Let's start with the older one. Fact or legend, Stephen's name change also changed his fortunes. He went from school teacher to Illinois Secretary of State, to Justice of the Supreme Court, to Congressman, and finally to the United States Senate. He became known as the Little Giant, famous for his ability to speak or debate from the stump. And one of his frequent debate foes, as you see here from this interesting, somewhat racist political cartoon, he was famous for occasionally giving vent to his enormous energy and unbridled passion on anyone who opposed him, including, by the way, journalists. Once when Abraham Lincoln's favorite newspaper man, Simeon Francis, had written something disobliging about Stephen Douglass, Douglass saw him on a Springfield street, attacked him, threw him to the ground, and attracted a large crowd who were fascinated with the sight of this rotund editor and tiny politician rolling around in Springfield's notorious mud. In Washington, Stephen Douglass did more than fight, although he did plenty of that. He became a superb legislator also, able to forge coalitions where others had failed, racking up the Compromise of 1850, for example, among his accomplishments. And then in 1854, he engineered what he believed to be the most ingenious legislative compromise of all, one he thought would not only end slavery agitation everywhere, but open up the West to coast expansion. It was called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and at its core, it introduced an innovative new policy called popular sovereignty, under which white settlers in the new Western territories could vote for themselves on whether to admit slavery or banish it. Douglass and his supporters hailed this innovation as reflecting the essence of American democracy. But from the West came a voice that pointed out that having white people vote on the fate of people of color was not his idea of democracy. And that man, of course, was Abraham Lincoln. Douglass, he charged, had corruptly created the means by which slavery could be made national and perpetual. A one-time, one-term congressman, absent for politics for 4 frustrating years, came roaring back into the public arena, aroused, as he said, as he had never been aroused before. Within months, he unleashed an attack on Kansas, Nebraska, and Douglass in the longest speech of his entire career at Peoria. This declared indifference, but as I must think, covert, real zeal for the spread of slavery, he said, I cannot but hate. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. Well, just 4 years later, following another intervening catastrophic moment, the Dred Scott decision, which legalized slavery everywhere, Stephen Douglas ran for a third term in the United States Senate. The new Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln to be his opponent, and that in a day when people were not nominated to run for Senate. Lincoln insisted on it, and they obliged. The race was on. From the beginning of that historic campaign, Lincoln was the decided underdog, outspent and outmaneuvered by the incumbent, forced, for lack of money, to follow him from town to town and answer him as the only means by which he could create a schedule and attract crowds. By early summer, the opposition press began ridiculing him. Since there were two very good circuses and menageries traveling through the state, one Democratic newspaper said, why not have them include a speech from Lincoln in their performances? In this way, he could get good audiences, and his friends would be relieved from the mortification they all feel at his present humiliating circumstances. Well, it is the pro-Lincoln Chicago Tribune that proposed the remedy that will make and change history. Let Mr. Douglas and Mr. Lincoln agree to canvass the state together in the old Western style. That's their suggestion. A few days later, Lincoln took up the idea and issued a formal challenge to Senator Douglas for you and myself to divide time and address the same audiences. Now, for his part, Douglas did not want or need this scheme for debates. But again, that old Western ethos dictated that he could not easily decline. He would have been accused of cowardice. So it was the Little Giant and Long Abe. And so it began in August 1858 at Ottawa, Illinois, and then at 6 more debates throughout the state. Each encounter a kind of staggering 3 hours long. An hour for the opening speaker, 90 minutes for the rebuttal, that's uninterrupted by interlocutors, but interrupted a lot by the audience, which was free to pitch in, and then 30 minutes for the last speaker to have for the first speaker to have the last word. Thousands came to watch and listen, and to participate by cheering and jeering. On hand, too, were the first stenographers ever hired to record, or at least attempt to record, the proceedings. And of course, this was a day before videotape and such. And that made it possible for newspapers throughout Illinois, indeed the nation, to publish the transcripts of these debates, and for Lincoln later to gather the clippings into a scrapbook and publish them as a book on the eve of the presidential convention of 1860. It became a bestseller, and he became the candidate. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's imagine ourselves back 160 years to the summer and fall of 1858, when 7 Illinois towns filled to overflowing with partisan crowds eager to hear these two men argue about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Dred Scott, in short, the whole momentous issue of American slavery, whether it could spread or whether it should wither and die, the human rights, if any, would be granted to people of color, and the very meaning of the founding documents that had so brilliantly, yet so imperfectly, consecrated American freedom and Republican government in the first place. So I invite you back now to that time and those places, not for 21 hours, to be sure, but for sort of an after-hours conversation that these two giants in their own way, might have enjoyed between debates, and knowing that they were in a race that had implications far beyond the borders of their state and long beyond the summer when, as one observer put it, Lincoln and Douglas set the prairies on fire. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce to you the Democratic candidate, Senator Stephen A. Douglas, and the Republican challenger, former Congressman Abraham Lincoln.
Hello there! Hello, National Archives! Hello! It's a pleasure to join you here tonight. As some of you know, I have some memories of this fair city. It was, and now figures had never been that easy for me. Of course, you know, my old law partner, Billy Herndon, could tell you stories. But you know, folks didn't abide him telling the stories. He'd go on and add a little spice and a little color, and at the end, folks would say, "Go on, Billy, just go on." But Billy'd go on. But while we're talking about stories, the judge has joined us. And with Senator Douglas being here, his presence will add a little dignity to the occasion and probably stop me from telling you many stories. What we are witnessing, ladies and gentlemen, is a dose of the famed Lincoln humility. A man as revered as President Lincoln, a man who's given his name to countless schools, towns, even the presidency itself, which many refer to as Lincoln's chair. That man needs no one else to lend dignity to anywhere he may appear. You're much too kind, Judge. I was having a story. If I may continue to make my point here. When we were debating across the great state of Illinois, I would often relay to the crowd that I had once gone into an establishment and found Mr. Lincoln actually working in that store that dispensed whiskey. The judge speaks the truth, for I did work there. What he fails to mention, however, while I was behind the bar, he was in front of it. I was sure he could not resist that response, and I've made my second point. I'm sure we will see much more of Mr. Lincoln's storytelling talents. Since we're talking about stories, I've become known over the years by the various books, magazines, newspapers. I didn't come here tonight to put the truth or to deny any of those stories, but the notion of me as a teller of tales to make a point or to point out a principle, well, I'm kind of proud of being remembered by that. I've never denied my enjoyment of speaking before a crowd, be it in the courtroom or a gathering that you provided us tonight. And you know me very well, Judge. Indeed. Since you've mentioned the debates, it might be helpful if we discuss politics back in the 1850s. This was a stormy time in our country's past. The sky above our great land was churning with the controversy that divided us into hostile camps. Men were arguing whether lands west of the Missouri River should be slave or free. Judge Douglas and I was two of those men. It's been nearly 160 years ago that Lincoln and I debated over that United States Senate seat from Illinois. Need I remind you that at age 21, I was Illinois Secretary of State. At age 27, I
was a justice in the Illinois Supreme Court. At age 30, I was a United States congressman. By age 37, I was a senator from Illinois. And at age 41, I was the leader of the National Democratic Party. I was considered for the presidential nomination for the party in 1852 and again in 1856, when the Buchanan supporters held out and got their man the nomination, but only after I agreed to withdraw my name after they had voted on the 16th ballot at convention. With that election behind me, I had the time, with my considerable speaking talents. I was ready to begin the re-election campaign for my Illinois Senate seat in 1858. I believed that popular sovereignty should exist in our nation. The territories should be able to decide whether they are free or slave, even before the state constitution. No questions asked. Let the people vote, up or down. This antagonized President Buchanan, a Democrat himself, so much so that he actively worked against me in 1858.
It was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 that put the taste of politics back in my mouth like I had never had it before. It upset the Senate that the possibility existed that the balance of power there might not be maintained as it always had. 2 states entering the Union, always, 1 slave and 1 free. Old Buck, President Buchanan, didn't want the boat rocked. He wanted to wait for Roger B. Taney on Dred Scott.
But they weren't afraid of working together to engineer my defeat at the hands of Lincoln. The national leadership of my own party, Buchanan and Taney, trying to bring about the defeat of their party's leader in the Senate? And despite being isolated by the party over my disagreements with Buchanan and the Democrats, controlling both houses in Illinois, I was challenged by him. This upstart lawyer from Springfield from that fledgling Republican Party.
That's correct. The judge was senator. I had a notion Senator Lincoln had a ring to it I kind of liked. Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune had seen our speeches from the summer of '58, and in an editorial said there ought to be a series of debates in Illinois.
What's remarkable is that the Republicans had a state convention, even though senators were elected by the state legislators, not a direct vote of the people. Needless to say, his carefully prepared remarks at the state capitol in Springfield caused me concern. He is the strong man of the party. He is as honest as he is shrewd. And if I beat him, victory will hardly be mine. Lincoln, I suspect the people want to hear your opening remarks from the state capitol from June of 1858.
Gentlemen of the convention, if we could first know where we are and whither we're tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it. We're now in the 5th year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until the crisis shall be reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. Have we no tendency to the latter condition?
Shortly after that speech, Lincoln challenged me to a series of debates. If he had his way, we would have had dozens, perhaps 100 debates. You must remember, everyone knew who Stephen A. Douglas was, but few people had any idea who Lincoln was. During my campaign appearances, guess who kept showing up? Speaking before, speaking after, speaking the same day, speaking the day before, speaking the day after. Mr. Lincoln, when would it stop? So I agreed to the debates as an effort to have him to thwart his dogging me across the state. Since we had already spoken in Chicago and Springfield, I said, Lincoln, the other 7 congressional districts would suffice.
Since I challenged the judge set the ground rules. And while I am mentioning the judge, that reminds me of the time that we were serving in the legislature and a bill come before us to expand the judiciary, add some judge seats. By the time the ink was dry on that bill, making it law, guess who got themselves appointed to one of those judgeships? Stephen Douglass. So when I refer to him as judge, it's not a term of respect. It serves only to show that I remember how he got that job. I've gotten off track again. In these debates, Judge Douglas was to speak first, and then the second speaker, me, would speak that hour and a half, and he would follow with his half hour. 3 hours total. Then we'd alternate the starts at each location. I had to answer some questions from the judge at the first debate in Ottawa. I prepared hard for that debate because...
I'm absolutely perplexed. What are you talking about? You were unprepared. I had you running in circles. You wasted my time in Ottawa. I caught you flat-footed, and your friends had to carry you from the platform when it was over.
You see here, friends, the judge has this keen ability to frame an argument that could start as a horse chestnut and end up as a chestnut horse. Now, at the Freeport debate, I had questions for you. You remember the crowd we spoke to that day.
Yes, I do. Estimates ran between 15 to 20,000 people gathered to hear each of us present our positions. But I was worried that I wouldn't get over there to present my position. When I got to my carriage, I was shocked to find that it had been smeared with foul excrement. And so not Ha, ha, ha. And so, not appearing above the people, I walked proudly to the site. As I approached the steps to the platform to take my place, I was assaulted by a watermelon rind, ricocheted off my right shoulder. As you see, in those days, the debates were very important in the communities. Politics were very different then, and emotions ran strong and deep. After speaking for an allotted 3 hours, people were still crying for us to go on. There were, of course, fewer diversions and no instant analysis by a group of network talking heads.
The second question at Freeport was, can the people of a United States territory in any lawful way against the wish of any citizen of the United States exclude slavery from their limits prior to the formation of a state constitution?
I answer emphatically, as Mr. Lincoln has heard me answer 100 times from every stump in Illinois, that in my opinion, the people of a territory can, by lawful means, exclude slavery from its legal limits prior to the formation of a state constitution. Mr. Lincoln knew I answered that question over and over again. He heard me argue the Nebraska bill on that principle all over the state in 1854, 1855, and in 1856. And he has no right to pretend to be in doubt as to my position on that question.
You all have learned that my question is now known as the Freeport question. The judge's answer is the Freeport Doctrine. Much has been written on whether we knew the consequence of me asking that question or whether we knew the consequences of the judge's answer. It did add fodder to the remaining debates, as well as what the Founding Fathers meant when they penned, "All men are created equal." When a man works by the sweat of his brow and cannot eat the bread of his labor, that to me is no democracy.
Mr. Lincoln, the written record is extensive on the subject. And with your last statement made right here, I take bold exception. Why, sir, I believe that you are absolutely two-faced on this question.
Senator Douglass, if I had two faces, why would I wear this one?
Let's move on. At Alton, the seventh and final debate, and my health steadily declining, I could barely speak and be heard by the crowd. Lincoln illustrated the depth of his skills as a courtroom lawyer, as he took the essence of those debates and created his closing remarks, if you will, to the masses assembled. Mr. Lincoln, favor us with those words with which you are now remembered.
Douglass says that upon the score of equality, slaves should be allowed to go into a new territory like other property. This is strictly logical if there is no difference between it and other property. That is the real issue. That is the issue that will continue in this country when these poor tongues of Judge Douglass and myself shall be silent. It is the eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. They are the two principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time and will ever continue to struggle. The one is the common right of humanity, and the other is the divine right of kings. It's the same principle in whatever shape it develops itself. It's the same spirit that says, you work and toil and earn bread, and I'll eat it. No matter in what shape it comes, whether from the mouth of a king who seeks to bestride the people of his own nation and live by the fruit of their labor, or from one race of men as an apology for enslaving another race, it is the same tyrannical principle. So the 7 debates closed. The fall election produced a narrow victory for the Democrats in the Illinois legislature, who in our day elected United States senators. Without getting into that further tonight, let's just say when the Illinois legislature convened, the judge remained senator from Illinois.
My answer at the Freeport debate drove a wedge in the Democratic Party, so that in 1860 there were 4 men vying for the presidency: Mr. Bell from Tennessee, Mr. Lincoln, myself as the nominee of the Democratic Party, and Buchanan's vice president, John C. Breckinridge, the choice of the Southern Democrats who bolted from the party.
That continued split in the Democratic Party took me to the office of President of the United States. The dissolution of the Union was at hand. The judge, at my request, went south to try to hold them in the Union. It proved futile, but the support of Stephen Douglass assured me of some unity in the North. Now it is altogether fitting and proper that we all should hear his last major address as requested by the Illinois General Assembly on April 25th, 1861.
Mr. Speaker, and gentlemen of the Senate and House of Representatives, I am not insensible to the patriotic motives which have prompted you to do me the honor to invite me to address you on the momentous issues now presented in the condition of our country. With a heart filled with sadness and grief, I proceed to comply with your request. For the first time since the adoption of the federal Constitution, a widespread conspiracy exists to destroy the best government the sun of heaven ever shed its rays upon. Hostile armies are now marching upon the federal capital with a view of planting a revolutionary flag upon its dome, seizing the National Archives, taking captive the president elected by the votes of the people, and holding him in the hands of secessionists and disunionists. A war of aggression and of extermination is being waged against the government established by our fathers. You may think that I am drawing a picture that is overwrought. No man who has spent the last week in the city of Washington will believe that I have done justice to it. You have all the elements of the French Revolution surrounding the Capitol now, and the threatening with its terrors. Not only is our constitutional government to be stricken down, not only is our flag to be blotted out, but the very foundations of social order are to be undermined and destroyed. The demon of destruction is to be let loose over the face of the land. A reign of terror and mob law is to prevail in each section of the Union. And the mad who dares to plead for the cause of justice and moderation in either section is to be marked down as a traitor to his section. If this state of things is allowed to go on, how long before you have the guillotine in active operation? I have struggled, almost against hope, to avert the calamities of war and to effect a reunion and reconciliation with our brethren of the South. I yet hope it may be done, but I am not able to point out to you how it may be effected. Nothing short of Providence can reveal to us the issue of this great struggle, bloody, calamitous. I fear it will be. May we so conduct it, if a collision must come, that we will stand justified in the eyes of Him who knows our heart and who will judge our every act. We must not yield to resentments, nor to the spirit of vengeance, much less to the desire from conquest or ambition. I see no path of ambition open in a bloody struggle for triumph over my own countrymen. There is no path for ambition open for me in a divided country, after having so long served a united and glorious country. Hence, whatever we may do must be the result of conviction, of patriotic duty, the duty that we owe to ourselves, to our posterity, and to the friends of constitutional liberty and self-government throughout the world. My friends, I can say no more. To discuss these topics is the most painful duty of my life. It is with a sad heart, with a grief that I have never before experienced, that I have to contemplate this fearful struggle. But I believe in my conscience that it is a duty we owe ourselves and our children and our God to protect this government and that flag from every assailant, be he who he may. There are only two sides to this question. Every man must be for the United States of America or against it. There can be no neutrals in this war. Only patriots or traitors.
You now see we was no longer debating. I valued his support. I wish I'd had a longer time to call on him. That was not meant to be.
We hope our discussion here tonight has given you a few thoughts to reflect upon, and perhaps some reasons to be more aware of the place the debates hold in this great nation's history. They played an important role in shaping our country's destiny. We are indeed one nation under God. Mr. President, would you please close with some appropriate words for our audience?
It's taken longer than I expected to accomplish many things. It took a long time to set up human slavery. It's taken a long time to destroy it. But destroy it, we must. Do not lose heart. I thought my lifetime was the sorest to live in. You may think the same of yours. My lifetime was the tick of a clock in eternity. Yours is the same. But let us strive on to the work we're in. There's darkness and there's light. We must look away from the one and look to the other. And if we have firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, and we add to that compassion, what other weapons will we need? You have been a most kind audience this evening, and the Senator and I are appreciative. Thank you.
And now, with your indulgence, let's continue the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Gentlemen? In their entire lives, Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln met face to face only 3, at best 4 times. And when they did meet, they spent much of their time locked in political combat, though not in public, where black men and white men seldom openly debated. One was a proud and brilliant radical, an aggressive advocate for racial justice who had run out of patience with the status quo. The other was an ingenious gradualist, anti-slavery, as you've heard, but a master of political timing, of leading when necessary from behind. But they develop a wary mutual respect and ultimately genuine mutual admiration. 2 undisputably great men whose furious dissonance in pursuit of what ended up as common goals made each of them even greater. Tonight, using the very words they used to describe their beliefs, themselves, and each other, and every word you hear from them tonight will have come from their own pens and mouths. And deploying the portraits for which they sat around the time of many of their major pronouncements, we invite you to see and hear them confronting each other again, as you might have had you been a fly on the wall in Abraham Lincoln's office during the Civil War. Now, by 1858, they have not met, but they're beginning to sound astonishingly alike, not only on the issue of Kansas, Nebraska, but on the inevitability of national collision.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free.
The South must either give up slavery or the North must give up liberty. The two interests are hostile and are irreconcilable. The just demands of liberty are inconsistent with the overgrown exactions of the slave power.
As the 1860 presidential election approaches, their positions have, shall we say, evolved. Lincoln, seen here that June, vows he will tolerate no slavery expansion, but will not interfere with slavery where it already exists. Douglass is prepared to embrace the idea of working within the system, but only to bring about slavery's extinction as quickly as possible.
I would act for the abolition of slavery through the government, not over its ruins. If slaveholders had ruled the American government for the last 50 years, let the anti-slavery men rule the nation for the next 50 years. If the South has made the Constitution bend to the purposes of slavery, let the North now make the instrument bend to the cause of freedom and justice. Let the freedmen of the North, who have the power in their own hands, resolve to blot out forever the foul and haggarded crime, which is the blight and mildew, the curse and disgrace of the whole United States.
Lincoln wins the election, and on March 4th, 1861, takes the oath of office, holding out a hope for peace and compromise, even though 7 slave-holding southern states have already left the Union. When Douglass reads the oration, perhaps one of Lincoln's most masterful, he judges it a step backward, not forward, in the campaign against slavery.
I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be by the better nature, better angels of our nature.
It was weak, uncalled for, and useless. The occasion was one for honest rebuke, not for palliations and apologies. Some thought that we had in Mr. Lincoln the nerve of decision of Oliver Cromwell, but the result shows that we merely have a continuation of the Pierces and Buchanans, and that the Republican president bends the knee to slavery as readily as any of his infamous predecessors.
The Civil War begins. As the Union loses battle after battle, Douglass implores Lincoln to enlarge the army, to disrupt the enemy home front by freeing and enlisting enslaved people. Lincoln writes the proclamation that would achieve this, but tables it, and begins issuing statements designed to assure white America that if he does act, it will be for military purposes, not humanitarianism. He is that fearful about white public response. Douglass at first tolerates the campaign of disinformation, but not for long.
My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification to my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. What good would a proclamation of emancipation do for me, especially as we are now situated? I do not want to issue a document that the whole world will see must necessarily be inoperative, like the Pope's bull against the comet.
He was elected and inaugurated as the representative of anti-slavery policy of the Republican Party. And yet, the actions of President Lincoln have been calculated in a marked and decided way to shield and protect slavery from the very blows which its horrible crimes have loudly and persistently inspired. He has scornfully rejected the policy of arming the slaves. He has steadily refused to proclaim, as he had the constitutional and moral right to proclaim, complete emancipation to all the slaves of rebels. To my mind, his policy is simply and solely to reconstruct the Union on the old and corrupting basis of compromise, by which slavery shall retain all the power it ever had.
Now Lincoln tries softening the blow further. Maybe not his wisest move, surely not his finest hour, by reintroducing the idea of colonization. Speaking to a group of free African Americans at the White House, he says this:
"Your race is suffering, in my judgment, the greatest wrong inflicted on any people. But even when you cease to be slaves, you are yet far removed from being placed on an equality with the white race. The aspiration of men is to enjoy equality with the best when free. But on this broad continent, not a single man of your race is made the equal of the single man of ours. It is better for us both, therefore, to be separated."
It does not require any great amount of skill to point out the fallacy and expose the unfairness of this assumption. For by this time, every man who has a brain in his head, including Mr. Lincoln himself, must know that in many places distinct races live peacefully together in the enjoyment of civil rights. Yet he says to the colored people, "I don't like you. You must clear out of the country." It is not slaves causing the war, it is slavery.
A proclamation. On the first day of January, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward and forever free. Signed, Abraham Lincoln, September 22nd, 1862.
We shout for joy that we live to record this righteous decree, free forever. O long enslaved millions whose cries have so vexed the air and the sky, suffer on a few more days in sorrow. The hour of your deliverance draws nigh. No, Abraham Lincoln will take no step backward. His word has gone out over the whole country and the world, giving joy and gladness to the friends of freedom and progress, and he will stand by them and carry them out to the letter. Mr. Lincoln will not budge an inch.
The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth. Other means may succeed. This could not fail. The way is plain, peaceful, generous, just. A way which, if followed, the world will forever applaud, and God must forever bless.
And now Douglass calls on his people to fight for their own freedom.
Men of color, to arms! Words are now useful only as they stimulate blows. Now or never, liberty won by white men would lose half its luster. Better even to die free than to live slaves.
The recruitment of black troops begins. Near Charleston, South Carolina, where the Civil War had begun, the fabled 54th Massachusetts Colored Regiment, which includes Frederick Douglass's own son, fights bravely for an earthwork called Battery Wagner. Many die. But still, black troops are paid less than white, and while white soldiers earn bonuses to buy uniforms, black troops must pay out of their meager paychecks for theirs. On August 10th, Douglass pays his first call on the White House. It is his first visit ever to that building and to a face-to-face meeting with an American president. And he does it to protest. He vividly remembers the meeting with the literally larger-than-life Lincoln.
On my approach, he slowly drew his feet in from the different parts of the room into which they had strayed. And he began to rise and continued to rise until he looked down upon me and extended his hand and gave me welcome. I began, with some hesitation, to tell him who I was, but he soon stopped me in a sharp, cordial voice.
You have no need to tell me who you are, Mr. Douglass. I know who you are.
Mr. Lincoln, I am recruiting colored troops. I have assisted in fitting up 2 regiments in Massachusetts and am now at work in the same way in Pennsylvania. I have come to say this to you, sir. If you wish to make this branch of service successful, you must do 4 things. First, you must give colored soldiers the same pay that you give white soldiers. Second, you must compel the Confederate state to treat colored soldiers when taken prisoners as prisoners of war. Third, when any colored soldier performs brave, meritorious exploits in the field, you must enable me to say to those that I recruit that they will be promoted for such service precisely as white men are. Fourth, in case any colored soldiers are murdered in cold blood, you should retaliate in kind. To this little speech, Mr. Lincoln listened with earnest attention and with very apparent sympathy.
I told Douglass about the opposition generally to employing Negroes as soldiers at all, of the prejudice against his race, and of the advantage to colored people that would result from their being employed as soldiers in defense of their country. Now, as to pay, we had to make some concession to prejudice, for there were threats that if there were soldiers of them at all, white men would not enlist, would not fight beside them. Besides, it was not believed that a Negro could make a good soldier, as a good soldier as a white man, and hence it was thought that he should not have the same pay as a white man. But I assure you, Mr. Douglass, that in the end they shall have the same pay as white soldiers.
He was the first great man that I talked with in the United States freely, who in no single instance reminded me of the difference between himself and myself, of the difference of color. And I thought that all the more remarkable because he came from a state where there were black laws. I account for his kindness to me because of the similarity with which I had fought my way up. We both starting at the lowest rung of the ladder.
Lincoln tries to explain to his old friends in Illinois why he has changed so dramatically on the subject of black freedom.
You say you will not fight to free Negroes? Some of them seem willing to fight for you. Why should they do anything for us if we will do nothing for them? If they stake their lives for us, they must be prompted by the strongest motive, even the promise of freedom. And the promise being made, it must be kept. The signs look better. Peace does not appear so distant as it did. I hope it will come soon. And then there will be some black men who can remember that with silent tongue and clenched fist and steady eye and well-posed bayonet, they have helped mankind onto this great consummation. While I fear there will be some white ones, unable to forget that, with malignant heart and deceitful speech, they strove to hinder it.
And yet by September 1864, Lincoln believes he will lose his campaign for a second term. Most African Americans, after all, cannot vote. The white North is so sick of war, death, and military failure that they consider a general as their next president. Lincoln prepares to turn the government over to the Democrats, aware that they will surely cancel the executive order known as the Emancipation Proclamation, probably on their first day in office. So Lincoln invites Frederick Douglass back to the White House and asks him to undertake a remarkable new mission about which few people know to this day. The assignment was to spread the word of freedom to as many enslaved people as possible while that executive order, while that Emancipation Proclamation remained in force. Now, we know that Lincoln ultimately won a second term, but Douglass didn't know it when he came to the White House. And he submits a long and detailed, and as I said, sadly forgotten plan to free as many enslaved people as possible.
Dear Mr. President, since the interview with which Your Excellency was pleased to honor me for a few days, I have freely conversed with several trustworthy and patriotic colored men concerning your suggestion that something should be specially done to inform slaves in the rebel states of the true state of affairs and to warn them as to what will be their probable condition should peace be concluded while they remain within the rebel lines, and more especially to urge upon them the necessity of making their escape.
The election was a necessity. We cannot have free government without elections. And if the rebellion could force us to forego or postpone a national election, it might fairly claim to have already conquered and ruined us.
The plan he asked me to compose was evidence conclusive on Mr. Lincoln's part that the proclamation, so far at least as he was concerned, was not offered merely as a necessity.
So on March 4th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln made his way to the Capitol a few blocks from here to take the oath of office for the second time, sat down on the portico and prepared to deliver the address that many Americans, including Lincoln himself, judge his best ever. It's drizzly and cloudy, at least when the ceremony begins. By the time Lincoln concludes, the sun breaks out, sending what one observer calls an electric thrill through the vast and for the first time, integrated crowd.
I was present at the inauguration. I felt that there was a murder in the air, and I kept close to his carriage on the way to the Capitol, for I felt that day I might see him fall. I heard Mr. Lincoln deliver this wonderful address.
Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled up by the bondsmen's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another, drawn with the sword. As it was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to the work that we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations.
For the first time in my life, and I suppose for the first time in any colored man's life, I attended the reception of President Lincoln on the evening of the inauguration. As I approached the door, I was seized by two policemen and forbidden to enter. I bolted by them. On the other side, I was taken charge by two other policemen who conducted me out of the window onto a plank. "Oh," said I, "this will not do, gentlemen. Just say to Mr. Lincoln that Fred Douglass is at the door." And in less than a half minute, I was invited to the East Room. I could not have been more than 10 feet from him when Mr. Lincoln saw me. His countenance lighted up, and he said in a voice that was heard all around,
"Here comes my friend Douglass. Douglass, I saw you in the crowd today, listening to my inaugural address. There's no man whose opinion means more to me than yours. What did you think of my speech?"
"Mr. Lincoln, it was a sacred effort."
I'm glad you liked it.
That was the last time I saw him.
Just 6 weeks later, just as Douglass had feared on Inauguration Day, Lincoln indeed fell victim to murder. And then 11 years later, on the anniversary of the president's death, it was Douglass who rose to deliver the principal address at the unveiling of a statue of Lincoln as Emancipator. And while the sculpture of Lincoln lifting a kneeling slave may seem politically incorrect by modern standards, it in fact had been commissioned and entirely funded by people of color. Douglass had enjoyed more than a decade to think about Lincoln, the man, the president, and the liberator. And this is what he says to a mostly white audience that day.
"While Abraham Lincoln saved for you a country, he delivered us from a bondage, 1 hour of which was worse than ages of the oppression your fathers rose in rebellion to oppose. We saw him, measured him, and estimated him, and in view of the divinity which shapes our souls, rough hew them how we will, we came to the conclusion that the hour and the man of our redemption had somehow met in the person of Abraham Lincoln. Viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardily, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of this country, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. Though the Union was more to him than our freedom and our future, under his wise and beneficent rule, we saw ourselves gradually lifted from the depths of slavery to the heights of liberty and manhood.
And these are the universal words that Lincoln deployed to characterize the struggle for union and freedom. Not the most famous ones, but one that seemed the appropriate excerpt to leave you with. And it comes from one of the few campaign speeches he made just before the election of 1864.
Having in my life heard many arguments or strings of words meant to pass for arguments, intended to show that the Negro ought to be a slave, if he shall now really fight to keep himself a slave, it would be a far better argument why he should remain a slave than any I have ever heard before. I have always thought that men should be free. If any should be slaves, it should be first those who desire it for themselves, and secondly, for those who desire it of others. Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. I happen temporarily to occupy this big White House. I am a living witness that any one of your children may look to come here as my father's child has. The nation is worth fighting for to secure such an inestimable jewel.